Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Joseph Jacobelli. I'm an analyst with Bloomberg Intelligence, been looking at the power markets in Asia since 1990 or so that makes me a little bit of a dinosaur. As a utilities analyst, I'm not very good with technology, as you can see. So I'll just take you through, just introduce a little bit what Bloomberg Intelligence actually is, and then I'll go into some of our forecasts regarding the Chinese electric power industry. And we're going to be talking about the possible outlook summary. We'll talk about coal, gas, nuclear, and all of the various clean energies, including hydro, solar, and wind, and where that's going. And obviously that has implications on metals, has implications on uranium demand and coal demand, thermal coal demand in China. So a quick one on Bloomberg Intelligence. We're part of the Bloomberg terminal, so you get us for free if you're a terminal user. You just type BI on the terminal and you can access our research. Couple of quick things about Bloomberg Intelligence. Number one, we think we've got very in-depth research on a whole variety of subjects. There's 300 analysts globally, including 50 in Asia right now. We're completely independent. We don't work for an investment bank. Most of us, including myself, used to work for investment banks, but now we don't anymore. Very comprehensive in the sense that we've got something like almost 200 dashboards looking at subsectors of, say, energy or subsectors of utilities, etc. If you are a user of the terminal, you can actually contact us directly. And we're very, very user-friendly. And again, we are part of the terminal, so we don't cost anything extra. And all of our research is basically data-driven research. So I changed the title a little bit, called it From Coal to Nuclear and Renewables, because this is really what's happening in China really, really quickly. Let me bore you with a couple of kind of state-of-the-land numbers first. So what we're looking at is, as you all know, the Chinese economy is slowing by Chinese standards, but not that quickly. And that obviously is going to drag down demand. The other thing that is happening is that there's a shift in the demand. It used to be pretty much industrial demand that used to account until about 10 years ago for 80% of the total. Now we're down to about 66%, and we're going to see this shift happening more and more going forward, which means you're going to need a lot more peaking capacity going forward. This is just a little profile on the generation, so you can see it's very sharply slowed down in 2014, 15, 14, and 16, but now it's picked up. And actually in the first 3 months of this year, you had an increase of 9.8%, which is at the kind of like the highest increase they had since about 2012 or so. So the numbers are still pretty strong. And the other thing which I think is of most interest to all of you is what's happening on the capacity mix front. And since about last year, I think maybe the February or March last year, there's been a major shift where now China is adding in gigawatt terms, and probably now in terawatt-hours terms as well, more clean energy capacity than thermal capacity. And Chinese most statistics don't split up thermal coal and gas, but the number is there was about 76 gigawatts of gas out of about 1,050 gigawatts of thermal in at the end of 2017. So that gives you an idea that gas is still very, very small in China, relatively speaking. A couple of things you got to know is that right now the health of the electric power sector in China is not great. Utilization hours for clean energy is coming back, but for thermal, which is all important, is very, very, very low. They should be at 60+%. And now, although it's improving, we've seen a 5% improvement in the first 3 months of this year relative to the first 3 months of last year, but it's still very, very slow, and that's hurting the industry. So this is a quick summary of what I'm going to talk about in the next 20 minutes or so, or 15 minutes or so. One is that, so we see the overall capacity rising about 1.84 by 2050. Now, most of you may say, why did you actually bother to do a forecast all the way to 2050? Because I probably won't be here to justify my forecast by then. The reason is simple, is because you want to see how quickly the shift away from thermal coal reliance is going to happen. And basically, we see coal pretty much peaking in 2021, 2022, and thereafter declining. Now, how quickly is the thermal coal declining in terms of the power generation fuel in China going to be? We're probably being very, very conservative, but as you see, it's going to be fairly rapid. Gas has got a couple of issues. One is the supply. It's improved enormously, but it's still limited. And the price on a per megajoule per kilowatt hour basis is still extremely higher than some of the other fuels available. It's all the way up there with oil fired generation. Nuclear clean energy is going to be exponential. You see that number, 2.8 times fold increase in clean energy. What this number doesn't tell you is that actually it includes hydro, and hydro, China's pretty much maxed out the hydro resources. Therefore, you see a much lower growth rate there. Let me just take you through some of these numbers. So what we think is the 2017 numbers are actual numbers. And you can see the thermal coal was around about 66%, gas 3%, nuclear 4%. And if I take you through the other fuels, wind was about 4.9%, and solar 2.4%, and other renewable energy was 2.3%, for a total of about 27%. And you see that these numbers, so clean energy is going to be at least 40% by 2050. And coal is going to go down to 33.7%. If you think that that's conservative, actually there's one institute in China that just came out with a number that put coal down to 20% by 2040. So our number is probably not as conservative as a first thought. And we can kind of dig down on some of these numbers later on if you're interested in terms of how we see nuclear and clean energy. So just a quick profile of coal. So you see that the utilization rates here are extremely low. They're improving a little bit, but at 4,000 hours per year, a lot of the power plants were actually not making any money at all. And over 50% of power plants in China in 2016 were in the red. Little bit of an improvement in 2017, but not much. And the major culprit for profitability also is not just utilization rates, but because of coal prices. So you see this huge surge from June last year all the way through January, where prices increased from about, that's just one of the indices, the Qinhuangdao port thermal coal for 1,500 kilocalories, which increased from about 548 renminbi per ton to a high of 751. So that basically hit all of the power companies in the chin because the government did not come through with a tariff adjustment in kind at the time. And actually, during that period of coal prices going up, some of the average benchmark prices actually came down. So that's the coal industry. So for our forecasts, we see, China is still adding coal power plants as we speak today, but at the same time, they're shutting down quite a bit, and they slow down the construction very quickly. So based on our numbers, in China had 1,030 gigawatts of coal-fired generation in 2017, and that's going to go down to at least 800 by 2050, but basically it's peaking in 2021, 2022 or so, and it's going to start coming down. And as I mentioned, it may come down more quickly. Gas is really interesting. As you know, there's a very sharp anti-pollution drive in China going on right now. And gas would make a lot of sense, A, because of the pollution element, and B, as a peaking fuel, as China is putting up more and more wind and solar. But again, the issue is and this capacity, by the way, is not small. When you're talking about 76 gigawatts of installed gas-fired generation capacity. But the utilization rates, as you'll see here, and this is just some examples because China doesn't give us a lot of granular data on the utilization hours of gas power plants, but this is just for one company as an example, and you can see how low the gas utilization rates are, and that's really not going to change. So China is going to be adding a lot more gas capacity in coming years, again, from about 73 gigawatts in 2017 to 272 gigawatts by 2050. So that's enormous, but it may not necessarily the amount of, and that's a CAGR of about 4% per annum, but then the gas usage may not necessarily be 4% per annum. Nuclear, which I guess all of you interested in uranium are looking at. This is what's happened. So China was very, very conservative until 2010. Then they started to really go for it when it comes to nuclear capacity. So they've already increased nuclear capacity from 10 gigawatts to about 35 gigawatts as we speak now. And the target has been 58 gigawatts by 2020 with about 30 gigawatts under construction. Now that 58-30 ratio may be a little bit different. Why? Because of this reason. The new generation, they're very, very, very nervous about the new generation reactors. So some of them are actually complete and ready to go and ready for the fuel, ready to be loaded. But they've been very, very nervous about it. And so if there's any minor hiccup, a screw that falls in the plant or something like that, then they'll just stop everything and double check it. And actually, the reactors need approval directly from the state council. So, before the reactor is turned on, it's not the normal authority, the NDRC, that says go for it. It's actually the state council. So it's a very cumbersome and slow process. But there's going to be at least one of the new generation reactors which is going to come through in coming weeks, maybe 6 weeks, as quickly as 6 weeks, maybe a little bit longer. And that's the Tianwan plant of CGN. And they're definitely going to be in full commercial operation by the end of the year. In terms of nuclear, what we've got, and China doesn't have official targets. I mentioned the 58 gigawatts from the current 36 by 2020, and we're looking at 308. That number is really just a minimum. It's probably going to be much higher. It depends on how they go with the new reactors, the new generation. If they feel very comfortable with it, then they'll probably go ahead and build a lot more. And they are developing even newer and safer technologies. Last but not least, let's talk a little bit about clean energy, and that's we'll go through hydro very, very quickly, but the focus on wind and on solar. This is the kind of pollution index. For any of you who've been to Beijing in 2014, 2015, and didn't come back with a cough, then that must be a miracle, because I did. It was really, really horrible. And it's come down quite dramatically. Now, we all know that obviously coal-fired generation is not the only reason for the pollution, but it was definitely a major culprit, especially the coal being used for heating purposes, which now is being replaced with gas. So so let's go very quickly through hydro. China's already got 340 gigawatts of hydro. we think that that's going to rise to around about 372. So the CAGR is only about 0.5%. And this is not because they don't want to, but it's just a resources limitation. And this is some of the kind of industries and institutes in China that came up and said, there's probably around about 540 gigawatts of exploitable hydro resources in China. But realistically, probably about 450 would be the cap, given that the rest would be very, very hard to get to. And there's also very much stricter environmental considerations that need to be taken. Wind. On the wind side, I mean, we all know about the story that basically China had something like single-digit megawatts just over 10 years ago, and as at the end of last year, the total wind installed capacity was 164 gigawatts of capacity, and that's going to grow exponentially, probably a CAGR of about 5% to about 800 gigawatts by 2050. So the growth is still ginormous. And in terms of what it is going to account for, we think it's going to go from about the 4.9% in 2017 to about 12.3%. So if China goes from 164 gigawatts to 800 plus gigawatts, it still only account for about 12.3% of the total. So we're definitely within safe territory before wind actually damages the grids frequencies and all the rest, especially as China is spending a lot of money on developing the grids. On the solar side, solar was a little bit slower to take off than wind, and really it's because of the price point, the dollar per megajoule or per kilowatt hour, compared to wind, compared to the other ones, and now it's coming down very, very quickly. And by 2020, actually, solar on average is going to be roughly at the same level as where wind is today on average, and it's going to be at the coal level by 2025. And that's not me forecasting; it's actually the Chinese government. So, and typically the Chinese government gets its forecasts right because it makes sure that they achieve their targets. So on solar, and there's quite a bit of controversy in terms of what's going to happen to rooftop solar. Some people are incredibly bullish about it, and they think that there's an enormous amount of capacity that can be had. But in terms of solar, we're looking at a CAGR slightly superior to that of wind, about 5.2%, going from about 130 gigawatts in 2017 to around about 690 gigawatts by 2050. And of course, last but not least, China has got plenty of capacity to build out the solar capacity because of its kind of in-house, at-home manufacturing capability and capacity. I just want to go back to the original slide with the summary and talk about a couple of things about what could happen, what doesn't happen, or what may happen, what may not happen. So we're looking at China increasing the total capacity from about 1777 in 2017 to 3625 in 2050. Call it double the current capacity. What could change? But basically, it's energy efficiency and technological changes. We haven't really factored in any potential technological advance. We haven't taken into account cheap storage solution. As you know, China is incredibly price sensitive when it comes to electricity. So if there is a miracle, i.e. cheap, very cheap energy storage solution, then these numbers could look very, very, very different. Also, what's not going to change is the whole pollution anti-pollution targets, pollution reduction targets, because they do, there's a very, very good understanding from Chairman Xi all the way down to the working level that if China doesn't take care of this very, very aggressively, then it's going to be the emission situation is not going to get any better. And there's a couple of anecdotal evidence. I mean, today it used to be that for you as a county mayor or as a city mayor or as a provincial governor, for you to do well, all you need to do is make sure that your GDP is higher than the average. And of course, you got some funny numbers where almost all provinces was higher than the average for some years. But that used to be the target. Now, actually, environmental pollution or the reduction in environmental pollution is a very, very key KPI for the leadership at the local level. So they really need to do something about it. And thus, the potential for nuclear as a base load energy for clean energy, for these numbers to be a lot higher, and for coal to actually fall off the cliff a lot more quickly is very possible. One last thing about coal was that they in the working report in March, they mentioned that they wanted to close down all units of 300 megawatts or smaller. And there's a few problems there because some of these units are actually there to supply heat during the winter. So if they shut them down, they need to be replaced with something else, e.g. gas. So it's going to be a little bit slower than expected, but they are very, very keen to shut down more coal capacity. So in essence, what I'm saying is the overall number may not necessarily be double the capacity, if energy efficiency solutions come through a lot more quickly and there's more technological advances. Coal may go down more quickly than expected. Gas, there's still a gas price and kind of supply reliability and the geopolitical issues as well that need to be considered. And there's a lot of upside in terms of our numbers for nuclear and clean energy. I think I've been very efficient, so if anybody has got one or two questions, we may have a little bit of time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Joseph, for a fantastic presentation there. I have a question there from Andrew.
Yeah, Joseph, thanks for that. You mentioned at the end there sort of a miracle cure for, not cure isn't the right word, but a solution to energy storage, which is the key to everything, because effectively energy is going to zero with solar because it's so cheap now. Have you factored in and looked at all at the VRB market and what's happening there? Because it does appear as though they've now got it economically commercial, and if it's rolled out onto a mass scale, then that would change your numbers dramatically.
No, I mean we've got a sister division called Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and they look at new technologies in great depth. We just basically looked at what we know now, and what we know now is that there's a lot of Chinese companies from at the group level, like the China Huanan Group or China Datang Group. They're actually spending a lot of money on developing energy storage solutions themselves. The issue is now that in China, an average kilowatt hour using coal is about 450 yuan per megawatt hour, 450. The government feels that that's kind of okay. They would like to even see it lower if they could. So if you add an energy storage solution and you add 20, 30, 100, 200 yuan to that 450 number, the numbers just don't work. That's why they've been pushing down wind. And now wind is around about 500, so very, very close to the coal average. Solar, and I'm not talking about the special auctions where you don't know whether the companies are actually making a return. Apart from the auction, solar now is probably 700, going very rapidly down to 650. So anything that adds to that number is just not going to be acceptable. China just announced they reduced the end user price by 10%, meaning that the grid now is going to make even less money than they made before. And that puts a lot of pressure on the generation costs themselves. And you see one of the reasons why you've seen these coal prices coming down since the beginning of this year was partly the government saying, coal is too expensive, and if they need to find a balance. They want to keep the coal jobs, so you can't have coal too cheap, but at the same time it can be too expensive because it's killing the coal-fired power generation industry. At the same time, they don't want to kill the coal-fired generation industry because it's still a base load accounting for 66%. It's a very long-winded answer to your question. The answer is no, we haven't factored it in. But being a conservative utilities analyst, I wouldn't factor in at this stage until that technology is there now. And I think there are a lot of technologies that are ready, but just on the cost curve is just not there yet.
You mentioned that they're developing a number of storage solutions. What are they? What sort of solutions are they looking at, apart from the vanadium?
Oh, you name it, and they're putting money into it, and they're not just putting money into it in China. I mean, it can be battery solutions, it can be other forms of storage, but they're not just investing in China. They're actually investing outside China in technology companies as well. Don't think in the US, but definitely in Australia. There's been some investments in Australia, there's been some investments in Europe as well. So they're very, very aggressive about it.
Any more questions from the audience? If not, please do grab Joseph afterwards if you'd like to follow up. But that was a fascinating presentation. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon.